Hi, my name is Chris Holmes. I'm the Stembler Scholar in Residence and Director of Biblical and Theological Education at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. It is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to this brief video lecture on the letter of Titus for Columbia Theological Seminary in preparation for the Biblical Exegesis ordination exam in January of 2021. First, I want to point out that I've created slides that you can print out and use as you watch this video. In addition, the end of those slides contain live links to resources that you may need in the ordination exam. So I encourage you to make use of the slides that I've given you and as well as those resources that I provided. I want to give you a brief overview of what you can expect from this lecture. So in our lecture this morning or this evening, whenever you're watching it, I want to do four basic things. The first is to ask the question, what do you remember about Titus? And to walk through some of the basics, some of the things you probably learned in your New Testament introduction class, but maybe have gotten a little fuzzy. The second is, I'm going to make a guess. If I had to choose a passage from Titus, there's one passage that I think is worth considering. Now, I make no guarantees here. There is no money-back guarantee that if this is not the passage that I was wrong. But I do think it's a passage that will give us some place to look at and think through how you might complete an exegesis exam on a passage like that. Then thirdly, I want to provide some general resources for Greek exegesis as well as reading and interpreting this part of Titus. And then I want to offer you a little checklist before submission. Of course, there may be many other checklists that you've seen provided by CTS or other folks, but I wanted to, as I was working through this lecture, I thought it might be helpful for you all to have in your hands as well. So to begin, what do you remember about Titus? Maybe not a lot. Chances are you're feeling like, why would anybody choose Titus? It's a very small book. It's only 3 chapters in length. And it is characteristically grouped with 2 other letters, 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, as has become known as the pastoral epistles. So if it's hard for you to understand or to remember what is distinguishing about the book of Titus, you're not alone. Remember, just as a way of reminder, that in critical New Testament scholarship, there is this sort of basic breakdown between undisputed and disputed letters, not champions. The 7 undisputed letters of Paul, these are the letters that most scholars regard as authoritative, as authentic from the hand of Paul, perhaps through a scribe, but certainly originate with Paul in his lifetime. And those are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Now, you will probably also remember that there are 6 disputed letters. These are letters that, for a variety of reasons, New Testament scholars have begun to doubt whether or not they originated from the historical Paul during his lifetime. Ephesians and Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus are the books, the letters of Paul that have been identified as the disputed letters. And as you might recall from your New Testament introductory classes, these letters, there's a variety of feelings about their authenticity. So, for example, in recent years, Colossians has begun to be appreciated, or people have begun to wonder about the possibility of it being an authentic letter of Paul. Ephesians continues to have some doubt cast on it. 2 Thessalonians is a letter that seems to be very dependent on 1 Thessalonians, and so that's why many scholars come to the conclusions that they come to. But what's important for the purposes of this lecture is that the pastoral epistles, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, are perhaps the most disputed of all of the letters of Paul. That is to say, there is a higher degree of confidence among New Testament scholars that these are not genuine Pauline letters than perhaps with any of the other disputed letters. We call these letters pastoral letters because they are all 3 directed to delegates or co-workers of Paul, and they have a sort of administrative or pastoral bent to them. But what's important then is to note why these letters are so distinguished, or why scholars are so convinced about them not originating from the hand of Paul. When critical New Testament scholars say that 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus were not written by Paul, they're not authentic letters, they raise a number of issues with these letters. Some of the issues have to do with vocabulary and writing style that they suggest are perhaps so different from the other letters of Paul that they couldn't have possibly originated from Paul. Probably more significant or equally significant has to do with that they all have distinct theological themes or emphases that are absent from the other letters of Paul. One of the most common is the idea of church order, right? Paul, or the author of 1 Timothy and Titus, provides a list of qualifications for bishops and elders and deacons and so forth. And this has suggested to many interpreters a form of church governance, a form of organizing the church together that happens much later than Paul's life. Often you'll hear this contrast that Paul and his community sort of depended on a charismatic leadership, that the gifts of the Spirit is really what sort of organized the church. And that it was only in later years, in this early 2nd century, that there was a need for established or formal church offices. Now, of course, spoiler alert, the problem with that is that Philippians is a book that bears witness to, at least in Philippi, some church offices that were already in form during Paul's life. Perhaps near the end of his life, but still in his life. But nevertheless, these theological themes, these distinctive elements are things that interpreters of the pastoral epistles have identified as markers of the difference from the other undisputed letters of Paul. The final reason that people sort of are questioning about these letters has to do with chronology. How do they fit into what we know or what we think we know about Paul's work and ministry? So, for example, Titus is written to Titus while he's in Crete. And the problem from a chronological perspective is that we don't know of Paul going to Crete from the book of Acts or from his other letters. And so for a number of reasons, there are some issues that interpreters have raised with the pastoral epistles. Not only are the pastoral epistles sort of set apart or distinguished from the other undisputed letters of Paul, interpreters often suggest that there is something like a common core that holds these three letters together. Not necessarily suggesting that they were all written at the same time or even by the same person, but that there is a sort of assumed core to these letters. So here are some of the assumed similarities among the pastoral letters. As I mentioned earlier, there is this explicit focus on church structures or offices, clear teachings about what qualifications are required or who can play these roles. Problem is that 2 Timothy, one of the pastoral letters, doesn't say really anything about this. There's also a sort of a focus on doctrine or right teaching. And in the sense that it becomes almost like a deposit of faith. It seems as though we're moving into what we know of from other early Christian writings about the debates about orthodoxy and heresy that characterize the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And so it seems to some interpreters that the pastoral letters are sort of moving in that direction of a system of doctrines or a system of beliefs that are correct. Rather than what we see in Paul's undisputed letters, where he's dealing with very particular local issues, like circumcision in Galatians or how to celebrate the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians. And so again, this suggests to many interpreters that they were written at a later date. There's also an assumption that the pastoral letters are really not great letters for women. You might recall 1 Timothy 2 has some of the most problematic language about women and about Eve in particular in all of the New Testament, all of Paul's letters. And so there's sort of this assumption that all three of the pastoral letters sort of have a negative view of women or a restrictive role about the role of women in the community. Now, again, that might be true of 1 Timothy and perhaps of Titus, but 2 Timothy really presents itself as a letter that sort of highlights the formative role of Timothy's mother and grandmother in his own formation of faith. And so, again, the core sort of begins to chip away at some levels. Once again, as I said, the vocabulary and writing style suggests to some that these are similar among themselves, among the three letters, but different from the other letters. So, in conclusion, when it comes to the pastoral letters, you want to sort of have in mind two tensions or two realities that relate to sameness and difference. The first is that there is an assumed common core of the pastoral epistles, that there are similarities that they share among themselves, but there are differences then from these three letters from the rest of Paul's letters. But this common core doesn't apply to all three. And we might also ask the question about whether or not there is a sort of a common core to the undisputed letters of Paul, or if they themselves have their own uniqueness and distinctive characteristics and theological themes. And so, really, all of this is a long introduction to say that we do need to read and interpret each of the three pastoral letters on their own terms. And so, for the purpose of the exegesis exam, you're going to want to know something about Titus. You're going to want to read your way into the book of Titus, and you may or may not need to say something about the pastoral letters as a whole. But it is something to be aware of that interpreters, scholars, tend to loop Titus in with the pastoral epistles, and therefore it may be an important thing for you to consider in your response to the exegesis exam. All right, so at this point you're probably saying, great, I remember the pastoral epistles. Why all this talk about pastoral epistles? Isn't the examination going to be on Titus? Fair point, let's get to Titus. So first of all, who was Titus? In the 4th verse of the first chapter of Titus, we learn that Paul, or the author of Titus, identifies Titus as, quote, my loyal child in the faith we share. Now, you may recall that Paul talks about his converts, his communities, as his children. In 1 Corinthians, he talks about the whole Corinthian community sort of as his spiritual offspring. And certainly in the letters of Timothy, we also get this idea of Paul as a father figure, as a source of origin for other people. And so here in verse 4, Paul identifies Titus as his spiritual offspring. He takes responsibility for him, for his care and nurture and upbringing, perhaps, is one way to think about it. Now, outside of the book of Titus, outside of the letter of Titus, there are several mentions of a figure named Titus. I've provided those in the slides for you, but what we can gather from these other references is that Titus was, first of all, a co-worker of Paul's. This much is clear. Paul mentions Titus as somebody who worked alongside him in the ministry of the gospel and in the formation of communities. We learn from the book of Galatians that he was also a traveling companion of Paul and made his way up to the famous meeting in Jerusalem with the other apostles. It seems as though that Titus is also an emissary on behalf of Paul to Christians in Corinth. He is also an assistant who is charged with helping with the collection for the poor in Jerusalem. And so all of this, this figure of Titus that we know from the undisputed letters of Paul, is in the background when we see Titus identified as more or less of an executive pastor in Titus 1:5. Titus 1:5 says that Paul left him behind in Crete to sort of put things in order and to teach and to form a community in a particular way. And so really this gets to the heart of the question about whether or not this is an authentic letter of Paul or an inauthentic letter of Paul. And the key question is whether or not we think that these other references to Titus were enough, that the figure Titus would have been popular enough or authoritative enough or significant enough in the early church to write a pseudonymous letter in the name of Paul to this figure. And so again, we don't need to muddy the waters too much about it, but these references to Titus are important. So enough about Titus, or the person of Titus as he's referenced elsewhere in the New Testament. What can we know about the letter of Titus? Now, I think it's important, sort of again, as a framing mechanism, to think that there are two basic categories to the Pauline letters. There are a collection of letters that are explicitly written to communities throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, and we see these in Romans through 2 Thessalonians. These are letters to communities. But then from 1 Timothy to Philemon, we see that there are letters to individuals. That's 1 Timothy through Philemon. It's worth pointing out that the order of the letters, as we encounter them in modern translations of the New Testament and in critical New Testament Greek translation or editions, is not the only order that they could have been possibly put in, and that there are also manuscripts from antiquity that put them in a different order. But there is a logic to this order, and it's important to know that the logic seems to be grouping them according to the type of letter, to communities or to individuals, and then ordering them by length of letter. So Romans is the longest letter. That's why it's at the sort of front of the Pauline canon. Philemon is the shortest of the letters to individuals. That's why it's at the end of the 4 letters to individuals. And so all that means is that just because 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy precede Titus, that doesn't mean that Titus was necessarily written after them. So the order does not have any bearing on the chronology of the letters. A little bit more about Titus. The question of contents is sort of important, give you a sense of what's there. It's an easy book to read in one sitting. It's only 3 chapters in length, but here's an outline that Abraham Smith has suggested in the New Interpreter's Study Bible. That the first 4 verses are an opening. Then there's a section of instructions on proper leadership. There's a section on commendable behavior within the church and within the household. Then there is a section about commendable behavior toward civic rulers and authorities, towards outsiders, and then a brief closing at the end of chapter 3. Again, you could find another outline in another study Bible, but I found this one to be quite helpful in how it lumps together material and helps us think through the contents of Titus. In addition, I thought it would be helpful to provide some comments, some introductory comments about Titus that might be helpful as you remind yourself of what's in it and you think through your preparation for the exam. Abraham Smith, again in the New Interpreter's Study Bible, says that Titus insists on sound doctrine, combats false teaching, revels in traditional hymns and ideas, and expresses a strong interest in making converts. Repeatedly, this letter emphasizes a concern for the unsaved and sees the good works of believers as a part of God's redemptive plan for the entire world. Now, just a few sort of key themes in there, right? The idea of false and true teaching is a really significant theme. So too, the idea of good works. You're going to see in Titus and also in 1 Timothy this emphasis on good works, that living out the baptismal identity of the Christian converts is really important in these letters. Abraham Smith also points out what's missing from Titus in comparison to 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, and that is no discussion of deacons, no distinction between elders and bishops as we see in 1 Timothy, again highlighting some of the unique perspectives of Titus. In addition, Matthew Skinner in the New Interpreter's Bible 1-volume commentary says something I think that's important for the exegesis exam. He says that Titus's comments about the Holy Spirit and baptism in chapter 3 verses 4 through 7 root its instructions in theological themes that are absent from 1 Timothy. Now, I think that this is an important point for our exam purposes. And here is where we get into the guessing game. If I had to choose a passage that would be a good choice for the exam, let's get right to that. So, as I understand it, previous exams have this structure. There is a section where you are asked a few questions about the language of the text, the historical situation, and the scriptural and theological context of the letter or of the passage. Then you're invited to write a careful and critical interpretation of the passage, and finally, in a third section, apply it to a ministry context. Now, if that's the structure of the exams, if those are the things that they're looking for this exam to demonstrate, then really they need to choose a passage that is going to have some nuanced Greek or some meaty Greek, but also something of theological and pastoral weight. Now, again, I'm guessing here, but I don't think the church offices are going to be the place that the exam committee goes. I could be wrong, but really I think that we're going to see something that has a greater pastoral and theological significance, especially as it relates to contemporary context. That all leads me to this conclusion. If I had to guess, I would encourage you to spend some time with Titus 2:11 through 3:8. So if you look at the Revised Common Lectionary, there are only two passages from all of Titus that are found in the lectionary. One is Titus 2:11 through 14, and the other is Titus 3:4 through 7. Both of these occur in the liturgical season of Christmas, and they appear in all 3 years of the Common Lectionary. And so this suggests to me that the folks that created the Revised Common Lectionary also had the sort of pastoral and theological significance in mind when they chose these parts of Titus to include in the lectionary. And so, again, being encouraged by that decision on the part of the lectionary committee makes me think that there's a good chance that this might be where the exam comes from. But in addition to the presence in the Revised Common Lectionary, there's also really important and weighty theological and pastoral themes. There's a mention of God's grace and baptism, redemption and the atonement, the second coming of Jesus, the Holy Spirit, the subjection to worldly rulers, and so forth. All of this is meaty and important as we think about Titus and the contemporary church. So if we can dig in just a little bit to these verses from Titus 2 and 3. Again, I could be wrong about this, guess, but here are some things that I've noticed and what I would think are sort of exam-worthy questions. So there is this Greek word epiphaino that is really significant throughout this section of Titus. The appearance, the revealing, the manifestation. And so I think that this has to do with how God shows up in the world, revelation, the significance of the incarnation, and so forth. Again, weighty pastoral things, but based in the Greek text. There's also some really curious use of the Greek word soter, savior, as it applies to both God and Jesus, which almost suggests a question about the Trinity and Christology. Does Jesus replace the first member of the Trinity in these passages, in these verses? That might be a place that the exam committee invites you to reflect. Then there's some sort of more technical questions about the use of hina in 2:12 and 2:14, or the use of kai in 3:3. I think also there's attention needed to the verb tense or the aspect of the verb throughout. And especially with the participles. Participles are one of the more nuanced and complicated aspects of Greek grammar, but they're so important for conveying the meaning. And so when we see an aorist participle, for example, or a present participle for example, and we try to figure out how those verbs, those participles relate to the main verb, there's some important interpretive theological weight that we might derive from that. And so, I think that this passage, of course, there's going to be unique vocabulary and things that you're going to have to look up most likely. But I think that the grammar itself suggests many places where we could ask some questions, where the exam committee would ask some questions to have you demonstrate sort of your facility in Greek. And so, again, I think that this is the case. I could be wrong. All right, let's talk about some general resources that you may already be familiar with, but that can help you as you take the exam. So I wanted to direct you to some online resources, right? COVID is challenging and causing us to change so much of how we learn and how we connect with each other. And so so much of that has been pushing things online. And so regardless of where you are taking the exam, you can access these online resources. The first is an online lectionary, or lexicon rather, the Liddell and Scott lexicon. Now this is maybe not the lexicon you use in your introductory class to Greek, but it is a standard classical lexicon. And so you should be able to access it with the link that I've provided, and you can type in either English characters or Greek characters if you know how to do that on your keyboard to look up words. And more than just trying to find out what the best English translation of a word is, what a lexicon can help you do is really figure out the sort of range of meanings that a word might have and its particular nuance or meaning in a given passage. A second resource is an interlinear text and online tools website, which really provides a whole toolbox full of resources for your engagement of the Greek New Testament. that will help you with recognizing words you don't recognize or even grammatical forms that are perhaps unfamiliar. As a part of that website, there is a New Testament Greek reader, and I've provided a link to the book of Titus. Again, I think that this resource is good for a quick search of the New Testament for when other words occur. So, going back to what I said earlier about the passage from Titus 2 through 3, the word epiphaino, right? You can look up that word. Where else does it occur in the letters of Paul or in the New Testament? What is its sort of meaning there? And does that give us any understanding of what it means in the passage under consideration? So again, a quick place for you to get help with the grammar, to do a quick word study, and so forth. And so I really encourage you to make use of these resources as you are completing the exegesis exam. In addition to those online resources, I also wanted to provide you with some print resources that may be of assistance. And so again, the links in the slides that I've provided will take you to PDFs that will help you, again, in the preparation and completion of this exam. The first is to a Greek reader's edition of the New Testament for the book of Titus. This includes a running list of vocabulary words that may be unfamiliar at the bottom. Again, a quick and dirty way to get into the Greek of the New Testament, and in Titus in particular. I've also provided several study Bible sections of Titus. So I've scanned the HarperCollins and the New Interpreter's Study Bible, because the running notes at the bottom of the page of both of these study Bibles are helpful. They will point out issues in translation. They will also add a few comments about the meaning or historical significance of words or ideas. And so it's good to have these sort of at your fingertips as you're engaging this passage and as you're doing the work of completing the exam. I've also included the very brief section from the New Interpreter's Bible one-volume commentary. I know that the library has provided or recommended the larger, much larger New Interpreter's Bible commentary series, but this gives you a sense of what's in there, and I thought it might be of assistance as well. And then finally, of course, you've already received the bibliography from the library, and these print resources are something to take into consideration as well. Use them as ways to answer your questions and to support your own careful, critical, and persuasive reading of the text. Finally, I wanted to conclude with a brief checklist before submitting. Again, if no one else has given this to you, I wanted to make sure that I gave it to you. If you've already received like 6 of these, I apologize for the redundancy. Here's the checklist. And again, I encourage you to print this off or to write it down. And before you hit submit, make sure that you've done all of this. As a faculty member, as a person who's graded plenty of students' work, it kills me when an obvious aspect of an assignment is missing. And so you want to make sure that for the purpose of this exam that you're doing everything that is asked of you. So the first thing is to make sure that you've answered all of the questions in section 1. Usually section 1 is going to be the one that has 3 or 4 sort of smaller questions. You want to make sure that you've answered all of them. Double check and triple check that you have answered all of them. The next thing is make sure that you have written a careful and critical interpretation of the passage in section 2 that does 2 things. Now, you're not going to pass the exam if you've done one and not the other. You need to do both. You need to present your interpretation based on your careful and critical analysis of the text, and you need to do some reflection on the use of scholarly resources. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to have a quotation in every sentence. That would also probably be an unwise decision. But you want to show that your careful and critical analysis is in conversation with other scholarly interpretations of the text. So it's really important that you both show your interpretation and how your interpretation is supported by or in conversation with other interpretations. Finally, for section 3, you want to make sure that you have provided a response, again, that does 2 things. That it addresses the ministry context. So usually at the beginning of the exam, you're going to get an idea of the ministry context. And so you want to make sure that your response somehow addresses that ministry context. And you don't want to leave your readers guessing. Make sure that it's clearly connected. But you also then have to connect it back to section 2. It has to flow out of your careful and critical analysis of the text. And so that's the tricky part of section 3, is making sure that the context, the ministry context, and the interpretation of the passage sort of are speaking to one another as you answer the question. And then finally, make sure, if it's asked of you, that you provide a list of works cited. Again, if it's asked of you, in previous exams that I've seen, it has been asked of people, but you do want to include that. Again, include everything that they ask you to include. All right, that's all I had to say about Titus right now. Please note that there will also be a live question and answer session on Zoom. We're welcome to discuss anything in this lecture that I've provided, or anything else that you might have in mind as you engage Titus and prepare for this exam. Thank you so much for your attention. God bless you, and good luck in your exam. We'll talk to you soon.